Okay, 8.6, solving quadratic equations by factoring. Yesterday we learned how to solve quadratic equations by graphing. Okay. So today we're going to solve quadratic equations by factoring using the zero product property. Okay, zero product property. What that means if the product of two quantities is zero, then at least one of those quantities equals zero. In other words, if I give you 3 times 0 equals 0, then you know that 0 times 4 is going to equal 0. Algebra speaking, when we use letters, we can say that A times B equals 0. Therefore, A will have to equal 0 or B will have to equal 0. Okay, let's practice using that. Using the zero product property to solve an equation. Okay, first I have to ask myself, do I have a product? Is this multiplication? Yes. Is this in the form A times B equals 0? Yes, it is. Therefore, I know that either A has to be 0 or B has to be 0. So I will set each of these equal to 0 to solve. So I'm going to have x minus 3 equals 0 or x plus 7 equals 0. To solve for x, I'm just going to add 3 to each side. I get x equals 3. For here, I'm going to subtract 7 from each side, so x equals negative 7. There's my two solutions, but let's check to make sure our solutions are correct. So my first solution, I'm saying that x is 3. So let's plug in 3 for x into my original equation. So I'm going to have 3 minus 3 times 3 plus 7. Does that equal 0? 3 minus 3 is 0. 3 plus 7 is 10. 0 times 10 does equal 0, so 3 is a correct solution. Now let's try it if x is negative 7. So I'm going to plug in negative 7 for each of my x's. So I'm going to have negative 7 minus 3 times negative 7 plus 7. Does that equal 0? Negative 7 minus 3 gives me negative 10. Negative 7 plus 7 is 0. Negative 10 times 0 does equal 0. So here's your correct solution. So your two solutions are 3 and negative 7. All right, look at B. Again, this is already in the form A times B equals 0. Excuse me. So I know that x equals 0 or x minus 5 has to equal 0. So here's a solution. Or if I add 5 to each side, x equals 5 is another solution. Again, let's plug in and check. Let's say x is 0. So I'm going to have 0 times 0 minus 5. Does that equal 0? 0 times negative 5 does equal 0. So 0 is a correct solution. How about when x is positive 5? If I plug in, I'm going to have 5 times 5 minus 5. Does that equal 0? Here I have 5 times 0 does equal 0. So 5 is another correct solution. So my solutions are 0 and negative 5. If you're following along on Chapter 6 in your Algebra app, or Chapter 8, Lesson 6, right above Example 2, they have this paragraph. Well, I went ahead and wrote it down for you because it's important. It says, if a quadratic equation is written in standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, you may need to factor before using the zero product property. The reason we're going to factor is because if we're using the zero product property, it needs to be in the form A times B equals 0. Means we're going to have to find two factors, so we're going to have to factor. Okay, so let's look at example 2. It is written in standard form. It's set equal to 0. But I'm trying to get it in the form A times B equals 0. Therefore, I need to factor this trinomial. And we learned how to factor trinomials a while back. What times what gives me x squared? We know that's x times x. What are my factors of 10? 1 and 10, 2 and 5. Which of these factors added together gives me 7? 2 and 5. So it's going to factor to be x plus 2 times x plus 5, and don't forget that it's set equal to 0. We are now in the form A times B equals 0. So to solve this, I know that x plus 2 equals 0 or x plus 5 equals 0. So I'm going to subtract 2 from each side. So x equals -2. Or I'm going to subtract 5 from each side. So x equals -5. These are my two solutions, but we need to check to make sure we're right. So I'm going to take x is -2 and plug it into my equation. So I'm going to have -2 squared plus 7 times -2 plus 10. Does that equal 0? This leaves me with 4 minus 14 plus 10. Does that equal 0? 4 minus 14 is -10 plus 10 does equal 0. So -2 is a correct solution. I usually box my solution after I check it. X is -5. I'm going to have -5 squared plus 7 times -5 plus 10. Does that equal 0? I get 25 minus 35 plus 10. Yes, that does equal 0. So -5 is a correct solution. Okay, look at B. What do we want to set this equal to in order to solve it? Remember, we want to set it equal to 0. So I'm going to have to move this 8, which means I'm going to have to subtract 8 from each side. So I get x squared plus 2x minus 8 equals 0. Okay? I am still not in the form A times B equals 0. Therefore, I'm going to have to factor this if I can. What times what gives me x squared? X times x. What are my factors of -8? I can have -1, positive 8. Because when I add them together, I want it to be positive, so my bigger sign needs to be positive. Or I could have -2, positive 4. Which of these added together give me 2? You can see that it's -2 plus 4. So this becomes x minus 2, x plus 4 equals 0. We are now in the form A times B equals 0. So to solve these, I'm going to have to set each one factor equal to 0. So x minus 2 equals 0 or x plus 4 equals 0. Add 2 to each side. So x equals 2. Or subtract 4 from each side. So x equals -4. Before I box these as my solution, I'm going to check them. So let's check when x is 2. I'm going to have 2 squared plus 2 times 2. Does that equal 8? 4 plus 4 does equal 8, so this is a correct solution. Okay, when x is -4, let's check it. I'm going to do it over here as I'm running out of room. -4 squared plus 2 times -4, does that equal 8? That gives me 16 minus 8 does equal 8. So again, -4 is a correct solution. There's two solutions. Okay, let's try C. It's already set equal to 0. And I'm trying to get it in the form a times b equals 0. So I know x squared is going to become x times x. My factors of 1, 1 and 1. If I add those together, I get 2. So it does factor. What do you notice? If I set each of these equal to 0, I get the exact same thing. So I just need to solve it one time. Subtract 1 from each side, so x equals negative 1. Let's check it. That gives me negative 1 squared plus 2 times negative 1 plus 1. Does that equal 0? That leaves me with 1 minus 2 plus 1 does equal 0, so this is your correct solution. Okay, example 3, our sports application. If you're looking at your iPad, chapter 8, lesson 6, you can see that divers that are like in the Olympics, divers can use quadratic equations to determine how long it's going to be before they hit the ground. So I want y'all to follow along with this specific problem. It says in order to determine how many seconds she will be in the air, a high diver can use a quadratic equation. Example 3, our sports application. It says the height of a diver above the water during a dive can be modeled by h equals negative 16t squared plus 8t plus 48, where h is the height in feet and t is the time in seconds. Find the time it takes for the diver to reach the water. When she reaches the water, her height is going to be 0 feet. Okay? So the first thing I always tell you to do is write your function down. Okay, we wrote our function down. What I'm going to do from here, it tells me that t is our time in seconds and h is the height. We remember we're trying to find how long it takes before she reaches the water again. So we want our height to be 0. So I'm going to take 0 and plug it in for h. So I get 0 equals negative 16t squared plus 8t plus 48. Now to solve this by factoring, I have got to get it in the form a times b equals 0. So I need to factor this trinomial. Remember, the first thing you look for is, do I have a greatest common factor? Yes, it's 8, but I'm going to factor out a negative 8 to change this to positive. So if I factor out my negative 8, everything else goes inside parentheses. Negative 16 divided, because I'm finding out how many times 8 will go into 16. It'll go 2 times, that leaves me with t squared. Minus, because a positive divided by a negative is negative. 8 will go into 8 one time with the t. Minus 48 will go, 8 will go into 48 6 times. Okay. So now, here's what I have. Let's see if we can factor this trinomial. Remember, we will make sure everything's factored completely. So, I have to find my factors of 2t squared. I need to find my factors of negative 6. And then my inner terms plus my outer terms have to equal negative 1t. Alright, so what are my factors of 2t squared? I have t and 2t. What are my factors of negative 6? I could have positive 2, negative 3, or I could have negative 2, positive 3, or I could flip the order and have negative 3, positive 2, or positive 3, negative 2. I could also have positive 1, negative 6, but I'm going to stop right here and try these out before I keep going. inner plus outer has to equal negative 1. Well, do y'all remember what inner plus outer means? I'm going to do my inner terms in red. So I have 2t times 2, which gives me 4t, plus, I'll do my outer terms in green. T times negative 3. That gives me negative 3t. If I add these together, 4t minus 3t gives me positive t. I'm looking for a negative t, so that's not going to work. Checking this next one, my inner terms. I have negative 4t plus my outer terms, t times 3, which gives me 3t. Add those together, I get my negative t. That's what I'm looking for, my negative 1t. So this is going to factor to be 0 equals negative 8. When I factor that trinomial, my factors were t, 2t, and then negative 2, positive 3. So really what I have now is this is in the form a times b times c equals 0. Therefore, if this is all multiplication, then one of these has to be 0. So I know that t minus 2 has to equal 0, or 2t plus 3 has to equal 0. Here I can add 2 to each side, so t equals 2. Over here I'm going to subtract 3 from each side, so I get 2t equals negative 3. Divide by 2, so t equals negative 1.5. Okay, t is your seconds. Yeah, I know, I have two solutions, and I'm trying to find how long does it take for the diver to reach the water. Well, if t is seconds, can time be negative? No, it can't. So this solution isn't the one we want. We're looking at 2 seconds. Okay. We will work on lesson 8.6 as a class together when we get back from spring break.